All right, it is 10 o'clock now according to my watch. So I'd like to welcome everybody. This is the Spring 21 Symposium for the RUC series. RUC stands for Rural, Urban, Collaborative, and in the speakers who will be talking to you today, you're going to have um, Tiffany Arnold will speak first, and she's speaking of the rural component, specifically Appalachia. Brent Sturm will speak second. He's also speaking of the rural component, and then we're also going to be looking at the urban side. Now, rural, as you know, is the more country-ish. Appalachian fits. Urban is more your city perspective. And so Robert Greer is going to speak to us about that. And then I also thought that we need to include in all of the courses we do, we need to include a component of diversity. And I was quite fortunate in being able to get Allie Lehman to speak. Allie is the president of Huntington Pride, and she's a wonderful speaker. And then I included a historical component in my mom and dad. They're in their dad. Mom is 88 and dad is 92, and I just felt like they could bring too often young people, and I'm going to include myself at 58 in that group. Often we neglect to capture the wisdom of our elderly. And so I thought this is a perfect opportunity. It's a short video. It's only 36 minutes, but they talk about growing up in the West Virginia, Eastern Cabell County in West Virginia, and what their experience was like in education. The next thing I wanted to tell you is we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're doing this symposium in this format because we can't meet together. Now, we've done this for, well, over a year now, and we had a faculty meeting this morning virtually, and I'm just really hungry to interact with my colleagues and with my students again. I tell myself every day, whenever I feel frustration at not being able to be with the people I work with and I care about, that if one of the most important skills teachers have is the skill of adaptability. If I was in a classroom on 9/11 when my principal came in and said America is under attack. That was a brand new experience for me, but dealing with diversity, dealing with unexpected situations helps build character. It helps build wisdom. It helps build skills that you wouldn't be able to get if OU decided, hey, we're going to simulate an unexpected situation and we're going to teach teachers how to deal with that. We couldn't have created something that's like this. So what I say is, when you're feeling frustrated, when you're wishing it was different, recognize with every day that passes, you're building skills that you couldn't have built any other way. You're going to be able to go into a classroom and bring students a completely different skill set than any other education class that's gone before you. Nobody else is going to have this experience. And so embrace the challenge of it, and have a positive attitude about it, because I think that will be real beneficial to you in the long run. So, all righty. Well, you're probably tired of hearing my voice, but Tiffany's here and eager to speak with you. And so, Tiffany, as soon as you hop up there, I'm going to switch you to our presenter.
I have a quick question for you, Martha. If students put questions in the chat, are you going to be able to monitor that for me, or how do you want to work that?
I can. What do you want me to do?
Well, I was just going to ask at the end, when it's time. I've been doing these, like, after a year, we've learned how this works, right?
Right.
Sometimes people will want to, verbally say their question, and then sometimes they'll end up putting it in the chat, and it's hard for me to manage both at the same time. So if you wouldn't mind at the end, if students have put questions in the chat, just yelling them out to me so that I know what's going on there.
Okay. I
Okay.
can do that. I'll keep track of questions, and then I can when you get ready, when you tell me, then I'll I've also got some matters I have to deal with where students are trying to join and can't.
Okay.
So I'll be taking care of that on this end too.
No problem.
All right. I'm not a Teams person. I'm a Zoom person, and so please bear with me. It's not showing me how to. Does anybody know how to move her over to the presenter?
When you click on the show participants at the top, the two little people.
Okay.
And you'll see my name with 3 little dots beside it. And if you click on the little dots, it should say like make presenter or something like that.
Okay. There you are. It doesn't have any dots beside you. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, when I highlighted on it, it came up. It says here that mute participant, pin, spotlight, make an attendee, and remove from meeting are the only thing I have.
If this says make an attendee, that means I'm already presenter, so I should be good to go.
Maybe everybody's set up as presenters.
It depends on how you structured it. We just did an Appalachian Studies Association conference, like I said, a couple weeks ago, where we did it all on Teams, and I had to be a producer for several sessions, so I had to learn.
Your presentation has ended. Looks like something went wrong. We're trying to get you back into the meeting.
Can you see my presentation at all?
Yeah, your PowerPoint is up, Tiffany.
Is it? Okay.
Dr. Arnold, sorry.
Okay. Did everybody else encounter a glitch just now?
I did very briefly. You froze for a second.
Well, mine actually threw me out of the meeting. Okay, if you get thrown out of the meeting, just hang on and keep waiting.
So can you all see my presentation in presenter mode then?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Then I'll get started. Nobody else has their camera on. I'm getting so used to like just talking to boxes. It's very, very weird.
I know, isn't that sad?
I like to see
faces
so I can.
I mean, not my camera. I'm going to turn off my microphone because I have dogs here and they might bark. I don't want to be.
Thank you all for like falling on that sword for me and turning on your cameras. This is nice. Okay. Well, like Martha said, my name is Tiffany Arnold. I am faculty in the College of Health Sciences and Professions. I actually, though, am a Patton College alum 2 times over. My master's degree is in curriculum and instruction. I was a licensed social studies teacher, and then my PhD is also in curriculum and instruction from Patton College with a focus on Appalachian studies. And so it was kind of an interesting way that I got there. My bachelor's degree is in political science. My family, my mom's family is from Pikeville, Kentucky and Grundy, Virginia. So when I think about, when most people think about the idea of what Appalachia is, they're thinking about those kinds of areas. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And then, I grew up in Morgan County, Ohio. And I went to Fort Fry High School. If there are any Fort Fry people here or Washington County and Morgan County people here, you know where that is, just about an hour from Athens. So what happened was I came to OU my freshman year, and I felt like I was in a different country because I was not used to so much. I mean, OU sometimes gets dinged a little bit because they say that we don't have a lot of diversity, but for me, coming from a town with 2 stoplights, it felt like there was a lot of diversity in Athens, and I didn't really feel like I fit in all that much, honestly, and had kind of a rough go of it. And so from there, I started thinking about where I came from and, how being from this region, defined who I was and kind of defined that experience for me. And so then that kind of led me after my bachelor's degree into looking more closely at Appalachian studies and the way that culture impacts people in terms of decision making. And that led me to coordinating the Appalachian Studies certificate in the College of Health Sciences and Professions and becoming instructional faculty, where the chair of my department likes to say that I'm the only dedicated Appalachian Studies faculty at Ohio University right now. And so I've been creating classes around that for several years now. So I do this similar presentations to this, kind of all over Southeast Ohio. I've done it for health departments and the VA hospital in Chillicothe. I've done it for the Southeast Ohio Legal Aid Society and different groups around campus. So, I'm pretty used to talking to people about why learning about this region and learning about, interacting with people from this region is so important. And I know you all will have both a rural and an urban experience in the classroom. There's a good chance that many of you will end up in this region. And so I think it's important for you to learn about, what that means and kind of the context behind that, as well as looking at some of the stereotypes that people hold about this region, because it's a place that is definitely had its fair share of mischaracterizations by people. So from there, I'm going to get started. This will involve just a little bit of audience participation at times. So if you all have like a pencil or a pen and a piece of paper handy, I'm going to ask you to write down a few words here in a second, and we'll refer back to those in a minute. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to think about the word Appalachia and what comes to mind when I say that. I want you to be as honest as you possibly can and think about the first three words that spring into mind when you think about either this part of Ohio or this part of the country. And I want you to write those down, even if they're words that, you probably wouldn't want to say to too many people because they might be offensive. Go ahead and write them down because, we're going to talk about why that happens in just a little bit. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that.
Hey, Tiffany, is your minor sociology?
It was not. No, I didn't have a minor.
Oh, my major was political science and my minor was sociology.
Yeah. Political science is not an area you can, it doesn't really fold into a job real well. And I after I interned in Washington, D.C., I got a little bit disenchanted with politics. So I kind of moved on after that. But
I did my internship in Jefferson City, Missouri.
Oh, wow.
Because I went to college in Missouri.
So when we start thinking about those words, I want you to take a look at some of these pictures, and I want to kind of talk about how some people may define the Appalachian region, and some of your words may have had something to do with these pictures. The picture up in the corner, up in the left, does anybody want to jump in if you know where that picture is from and tell me where that picture is from? And you can use the raise hand feature as well if you want. That would be good.
I believe it's from the movie Deliverance.
It is from Deliverance. It's funny because the older I get, like the fewer people know that movie, so it's harder to use. But yeah, that's exactly right. So that is a picture from Deliverance, which is a movie that came out in the 70s. It actually won Best Picture, but it portrayed the region in a really negative and offensive way. It involved a lot of violence, some really terrible rape scenes, and it really solidified in people's minds what they believed. They already had ideas of what the region was because of different things like the war on poverty and different events like that. And this movie kind of just confirmed that for them, that they're like, oh, look, it really is like this. So I was right all along. And that's kind of similar to these other pictures. The picture beside it with the women, with the woman and the children, that was from Look magazine. They did a special in 1964 called The Faces of Poverty. And on the front, they put this picture of a bunch of white people, right, that look like they're maybe struggling a little bit. You have a lot of kids there. It's black and white. And why do you think that they would, they did this to really draw attention to the war on poverty and trying to get that momentum going and support for the war on poverty. So that happened in 1965. Why do you think that they would want to focus on Appalachia to get people to be supportive of helping people in poverty at that time? Does anybody have any guesses? Yeah, Jack.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Like mainly because in the mid 60s, most white people in America weren't really concerned with the socioeconomic status of black people in America, and those were the people who made up like the largest impoverished population. So appealing to the sensibilities of white people looking at other white people in poverty as opposed to looking at impoverished black people is like more likely to make them think that there's like a real problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. At the time the civil rights movement was happening, there was a lot of racial tension in the country, which unfortunately, you know, at times there still is today. But then when they were trying to get support for something like the war on poverty, they wanted to make the face of the war on poverty white so that people would largely support it. And what this did is really reinforce the idea that everybody in this region is struggling and poor and, you know, tons of kids and kind of kept this image of what we are going. And I will be the first to tell you that there are a lot of struggles in this region, and poverty is certainly one of them. But I don't want that to, you know, sometimes it's used synonymously with the idea, you know, Appalachia and poverty are used interchangeably, and that should not be the case because that doesn't define our culture. We are much more than than being, you know, the struggles that we're enduring. And so yeah, we definitely do have our share of poverty here, more than parts of the rest of the country. But they definitely wanted to make sure that people knew that there were poor white people in the country so that they would support the war on poverty. The rest of these pictures are things that you might think of. We have a picture here of guys doing drugs with the Confederate flag. Strip mining, coal mining is very much a part of Appalachia and our history and our culture. A dilapidated house here with maybe some things in the yard. I think that's a pretty common image that comes to mind for some people when they think of this region. And then also down here, you have some men doing what's called snake handling, which is associated with some religious practices here in the region. So this is how some people would define it. But I also want to, you know, and I want to put that out there because these things, you know, this is what some of this is, you know, a lot of this is based in reality. But also I wanted to say that this is how other people define the region. So, you know, here we have pictures. This up here in the corner is Crystal Wilkinson. She's an Appalachian poet from Lexington, Kentucky, that writes about being a person of color in the region. A lot of people think that Appalachia is all white, and that is not the case. We have a picture of the Blue Ridge Parkway from Asheville, North Carolina. A lot of people associate natural beauty with the region. Ohio University in Athens, and then we have the farmers market and a coal miner. So, you know, there's a problem with only believing one or the other of these slides, right? The first set of slides is sort of negative and reinforcing stereotypes. The second set of slides are a lot more positive and, you know, a source of pride for people in the region. But if we only believe one or the other of these, then we're going to run into issues with not, you know, understanding the region as a whole. So if you're only coming at it from a deficit-based perspective, you're not going to understand that there are many assets in this region and many strengths that we need to make sure that we're drawing on, especially if you're going to be somewhere like in a classroom with students from this region. Because when I was growing up, we were not necessarily taught that this was a good place to be and to want to stay. And that's something that really could, you know, be improved upon in the classroom because it helps provide students with a sense of belonging. And it also, you know, practically speaking, goes very far in helping protect the small communities in this region who are struggling because people leave at a very rapid pace because they're often taught that to stay here is a failure and that to succeed they have to leave. So we definitely don't only want to believe those first slides, but we also don't want to only believe the second slides because we don't want to ignore that there are a lot of struggles here. And these are struggles that you will see in the classroom with students that you're working with, you know, in interaction with their parents and other teachers and that kind of thing. So before we really get into the meat of it all, I wanted to take a minute to define sort of define the Appalachian region. If you walked into a room of 100 different people at an Appalachian Studies Association conference and asked what is Appalachia, you're probably going to get 100 different answers because it is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. We can define it culturally, politically, and, oftentimes, most of the time geographically. The United States defined Appalachia by creating the Appalachian Regional Commission, and they selected, through a series of different benchmarks, what would be defined geographically in this country as Appalachia. And so Appalachia is actually 205,000 square miles. It is parts of 12 states and all of West Virginia, which is something that surprises a lot of people because a lot of people think that Appalachia is basically Southeast Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and maybe a little bit Virginia, like that southern area where the purple and the yellow are. They don't realize how far north it goes. Most of Pennsylvania is Appalachia. Parts of New York, all the way down into Mississippi. And so I want to make sure that you all understand this because when people talk about the region and they use stereotypes to define it, it's factually incorrect, beyond just being offensive, because there's not one stereotype that you can apply to 420 counties, right? There's not one stereotype that 13 states are going to embody. So when you define the region that way, you're really ignoring the geographic diversity that we have. So I wanted to put that out there. So when we talk about Appalachian culture, there are 5 myths that I want to kind of debunk right away. These are things that people think make Appalachia unique, but in reality aren't really true. And those are that Appalachia is not all poor and it is not the poorest place in the US. Like I said, we certainly have struggled with poverty throughout the years and we still do currently, but it is not entirely poor. We have a lot of socioeconomic diversity. It is not all rural. And it is not the most rural part of the country. Pittsburgh is in Appalachia. Asheville, North Carolina is in Appalachia. We do have some more urban areas. A lot of it is very rural and sometimes isolated, but it is not entirely rural. We are not all white, and we are not the whitest place in the U.S. We've had diversity from the very beginning. Coal mining did a lot to bring diversity to this region. A lot of people came from, Eastern Europe. We're known for having a lot of Scotch-Irish and Irish settlers, which is true, but we also had a lot more than that. We had Romanians and Italian people and people from Africa, and we had African Americans, at that time. So we are not the most rural place, or we are not the whitest place in the U.S. We are not all mountains. Southeast Ohio is the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And we are not pre-modern, which is kind of funny because I joke about the fact that like my dad does not have high-speed internet, which makes it feel like he's a little bit pre-modern. But in reality, we are not like this perfectly preserved, group of people that are like from the 1920s that like hold on to these like archaic ways of life, which is what a lot of people think that we are. And so those are kind of some things I wanted to put out there right at the beginning so that you all know that, these ideas that you may have in your head that have come from very, real places about what we are may not necessarily be true. We do have some unique features that are very much Appalachian. And we have a lot of character traits that, are not necessarily unique to this region, but are highly concentrated in this region. And that's something to understand if you're going to be, if you're going to try to understand Appalachian students and their families and the situation that, they came from. And so I wanted to make sure to put that out there. I really like this quote. This is from an article that's discussing, defining stereotypes. And, I think it really kind of hits the nail on the head in terms of how, people think about different areas when they've never seen it. And so it says, for the most part, we do not first see and then define. We define first and then see. In the great blooming, buzzing confusion of the outer world, we pick out what our culture has already defined for us and we tend to perceive that which we have picked out in the form stereotyped for us by our culture, which is basically saying that a lot of people form ideas about a place before they ever see it for themselves. And so when in your brain, you're thinking, you know, this entire region is poor. They, all live in mobile homes and they all, they're all white. When you go to a place, then yeah, you're going to see that. You're going to see people, struggling and people living in situations that are not ideal because that's what you're expecting to see. But if in your, if you think that when you go to some place, you might see a really strong sense of community and a really strong community who's trying to come back from kind of not great times, then you're going to see more of that. So I just wanted to let you all know that, when you have these predefined ideas in your head of what something is, then that's definitely going to be the first thing that comes to mind when you go to a place. So try to keep an open mind when you go into schools and into communities in an Appalachian region. And, in this area, schools are extremely important because they're often centers of a community. When you live in a rural area, a school is more than just a place that your kids go during the day. They're a place that you hold events, or you go to socialize and things like that. So a school is really a lifeblood of a small community in rural areas. So when we start thinking about stereotypes and where how they're still being perpetuated, we have to look at the role that pop culture has played. And the way that the region is presented in modern day, books and movies and TV is a lot of the reason that people still hold these antiquated stereotypes about Appalachia in their head. Up here in the left corner, we have Snuffy Smith. This was an old cartoon strip that has been around for a really long time. And it's pretty funny, but honestly, it portrays the region pretty negatively. Snuffy Smith's kind of he's drunk all the time. He's lazy. His wife is always nagging him. She's raising the kids basically by herself. So it kind of, reinforces a lot of really old ideas about this region. This picture in the middle here, you all probably, if you're of a certain age that is younger than me, you probably don't even know who these people are, but these are the original Beverly Hillbillies. The Beverly Hillbillies was a TV show that was on for a good while, but it was actually about a family from Missouri, which is the Ozarks. A lot of people get Appalachia and the Ozarks confused with each other. They're two distinct places, but they do share a lot of similarities. And then we have different shows like we see Appalachian Outlaws here on the History Channel and the Moonshiners on the Discovery Channel. These are TV channels that are meant in theory to be educational for people. So when we see shows like this, portraying us in a certain way on these channels, it's hard for people to believe that that isn't true because these are channels that people look to for real information. But the fact of the matter is, Moonshiners is entirely fabricated. There are moonshiners. I have moonshiners in my family, but it is illegal, and people who actually are making moonshine are not going to take a camera crew out to where they're producing moonshine. So keep that in mind when you're watching shows like this. Excuse me. In more modern times, this right here is from the show Shameless. If anybody watches that, they go to Kentucky because Kevin finds out that he was adopted and his original family is from Kentucky. When they go there, you see every stereotype in the book about the region. You see them talking about incest and racism. Obviously, this has a Confederate flag in the picture, and poverty and just all kinds of stuff. Cletus from The Simpsons is a very popular character who is definitely portraying the region in a certain way. Down here in the bottom, the last picture I wanted to talk about, this is it was called it's The Dukes of Hazzard, and it was a TV show for a long time, and then there's also been a movie that was kind of based on that called The Dukes of Hazzard. And they were from Kentucky, and these two guys were cousins who got into all kinds of shenanigans and did crazy things. And they drove this car called the General Lee, and it had a Confederate flag on the top. And so, that really goes a long way to putting this idea out there that everybody from this region, believes in flying the Confederate flag and maybe, racist and have certain, ideas about the culture. And so I want to make sure that we address those head on and that you can understand the role that pop culture plays in defining for you what Appalachia is. Um, a lot of times, a lot of Appalachian scholars talk about the region as being kind of an idea, right? We're not a culture that's like indigenous, like a Native American culture or a Pacific Islander culture. We're more of a culture that has evolved over time and has sort of been created. So, throughout our history, different events have happened, like the war on poverty and coal mining, and different things have happened that have created this idea of what Appalachia is. And a lot of times people don't necessarily care about the reality of it. They care more about the idea that's in their heads. And so in some ways, people from this region have begun to embrace that idea and have said, well, if this is what everybody believes we are, I guess this is what we are. And so unfortunately, sometimes you'll see that happening. In my dissertation, a lot of students, what I did is I interviewed former students of mine who were in a program called Upward Bound, which is a federal TRIO program. And I interviewed them and asked them, and I have some quotes from them here in a minute, what is Appalachia, and are you Appalachian? And many of them said that they were not, because they didn't feel that they were the stereotypes. They weren't like the other people they saw in their schools. They weren't wearing camouflage every day and hunting all the time and had big trucks or whatever, right? Like that's what they thought Appalachia is, because they haven't been taught any different. And so you will see people in schools that embrace that idea of what they think this region is. And so to a certain extent, it sort of is that, but it is so much more than that people don't realize. So I kind of wanted to put that out there for you all. So when we talk about the students that you might be working with in the future and the parents, it's important to kind of think about some characteristics and values that are often ascribed to Appalachian people. These aren't necessarily true, but these are things that people think about Appalachian people. Some of them are true and some of them aren't so much. Resiliency. The people in this region have been through, we have a very single industry based economy, and a lot of times that economy is based around extractive industry. So coal mining, right now hydraulic fracturing. Before coal mining, we were based around logging, and that has led to a very boom and bust economy where we've had these cycles where people, are making okay money and then they're just not because the industry leaves. And so, we've had a lot of that. We've been portrayed in a lot of different ways. One of those, the media has been very bad about, kind of latching on to Appalachia and these cycles and doing some parachute journalism where they come in for about a day or two and then they go out and they write about how terrible it is here without really understanding what they're looking at. And this happened lots of different times. It happened in 2016 election when Hillbilly Elegy came out, which, by the way, is not a book I would ever recommend reading. I just want to put that out there, and that is a rant that I will save for another day. But if you're interested in why that book for me is not a good representation of the region, I'm happy to let you know. And then it happened again recently when Joe Burrow won the Heisman Trophy. So when that happened, a lot of journalists from all over the country descended on Athens, and they they took pictures and they were here for just a very short period of time. And, Joe had mentioned in his speech that there was a lot of issues of food insecurity here, which there are. And so they, that fund was started. If you didn't know, they started a fund and they raised about $500,000 in a very short amount of time for the Athens County Food Pantry, which was amazing. It was amazing that people, were working together to try to combat this issue that we have. However, that once again pointed the national spotlight on Southeast Ohio and made a lot of people come here. And then those journalists portrayed this region in a way that was not very favorable. And it wasn't dynamic, right? Stereotypes are very flat. And so when you use a stereotype to define something, you're not understanding the complexity behind it. And so I think resilient is definitely one that embodies Appalachian people. Appalachian people are often thought of as being religious, independent, self-reliant, and proud. Neighborly, family oriented, which I know family oriented is something that is everywhere, but here Just spending a little bit of time here, you'll find out people here are extremely connected to family, and prioritize family above all else, which is something that you will see in the classroom. You might get into a situation where a grandma's in the hospital. So the entire family will go to the hospital, even if there's nothing you can do, and just sit there and wait. Unfortunately not right now because we're in a pandemic, but normally that's how it would work. Humble and modest, connected to place. There's something about this region that people love and want to stay here. Patriotic. This region is, we've had more people die in foreign wars than any other part of the country. And so a lot of people will think that that means that we're patriotic. There are people who are legitimately patriotic, but a lot of times why people are dying in wars and joining the military at a very rapid rate is because when you are growing up in a situation where you don't know that you can afford to go into college right away, or you have not had a situation where you've had a lot of resources, the military is a really good option for people. So we have a lot of young people, that's the best option for them at the time. People here are known to be fairly private. And people often think this region is uneducated and unintelligent. Those words are often used interchangeably, and they should not be, because they are not the same word at all. We do have an education gap. So we are graduating students from high school actually at a little bit higher rate than the rest of the country, but we do have quite a sizable education gap when it comes to them moving on to post-secondary education. So a lot of times, it's a hard sell to get people to go into higher ed when you come from an area that isn't going to have an economy to support you when you get out, and a place that maybe they haven't necessarily been encouraged in those ways a lot of the time. A lot of people, say that people in this region are mistrustful of outsiders and authority. And I did not go into a lot of history. I'm not going into a lot of history in this presentation, but if I did, you would see that there's a legitimate reason for this, right? Throughout history, people in this region have been exploited time and time again by various places for money. And oftentimes we have, the government or industry or somebody promising that they're going to help us out of our situation, and then we end up being worse off than we were before. In some ways that happened with the war on poverty. That definitely happened with coal mining and is happening now with hydraulic fracturing. Like I said, a very boom and bust economy. And the idea of people being fatalistic is often ascribed to this region, which is kind of this mentality where it's like, oh, I can't do anything to fix it, so I might as well just give up. Whatever happens, going to happen. And I guess to a certain extent, that can be true, because when you are in a situation that you've struggled for so long, at some point it's hard to, be able to imagine long term that there'll be a solution to that. What I don't want to do is have people fall into the culture of poverty mindset about people in this region. And that is the idea that instead of a lack of resources, that we have a lack of character in this region. So it's the idea that people are poor because there's something wrong with them, that they have a character deficit, or they're flawed in some way. And it really ignores the institutional and systemic reasons for poverty here. So I want to make sure that you all are, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, are understanding that, people here are not struggling because they don't want to do any better. They're struggling because we have had systems put in place that keep people in the situation that they're in, unfortunately. And a lot of people are promising, to save us from ourselves, and that never happens. So I'm going to read these because I'm sure that some of the text is a little bit small on your all screen, but I wanted to include some quotes from my dissertation where I talked to Appalachian young people about being from this region, because these are some attitudes that I think that you should be aware of, that you might encounter when you are working with Appalachian students and their families. So one of my students described Appalachia. He said, they always seem to be the ones struggling to make it financially in a lot of ways, and culturally in a lot of ways. Tina said, I feel like we just kind of stick together and we don't stray too far from what we're used to. Sally said, it's made me who I am, so that's good for me. But at the same time, if you say, oh, I'm from Appalachia, Ohio, like people are like, oh, so you're a dumb redneck. And that's a negative, because going to college and stuff, like even if you make something better of yourself, people still go, oh, you're from there. That means you're always going to have a little bit of backwoods, hick in you. Louise said, when you come from a community where everybody cares about everybody, I can't think of a single time I ever went without not having something that I needed, or any of my friends. If somebody didn't have something, we brought it. And Twig said, but there's one thing I would say about Appalachia, the families. Families are really, it means a lot. In some places, family doesn't mean as much, but around here, people will give the shirt off their back if it means helping their mom out or helping a brother out. And it's just, people are very close out here. You have to rely on each other. So these are sort of some varying thoughts that people in my dissertation had about being from this region. And I think that they're fairly representative of a good mix of ideas that people have. And even, people that are from here may recognize all of the positive things, but also still feel very negatively towards their own culture, which is something that you might encounter quite a bit. The one from Sally was very, hurtful to me when thinking about her going to college and being embarrassed to say where she was from, because we aren't lifted up here. A lot of times we aren't lifting each other up. We aren't instilling pride in our own culture and instilling a positive cultural identity, which leads people to want to leave. So a few things I wanted to mention about Appalachian families in terms of seeking help from any public service, really. So healthcare, job and family services, anything else you can think of, and especially education. There are some barriers that are in place that might prevent people from reaching out to you as an educator for help. Because there's a lot of associations that people make between, especially education systems, because they view them as a subsidiary of the government. And so there may be some cultural issues at play. So some barriers to seeking help financially, right? So if you think about wanting to talk to a parent about a student and you're expecting them to come in during parent-teacher conferences or whatever, there are some issues about, that may be preventing them from doing that. They may work a job that has non-standard work hours. They may work at Walmart at third shift and can't come in the evenings, or they may be, asleep in the evenings or have a lot of young children at home. And so they're not able to take time off of work to do that. They may be working minimum wage jobs that don't have sick time or vacation time. Logistically, if you haven't spent much time in a rural area, you might not realize that there is not much public transportation. In Athens, we're getting better. Rural Action and some of these places have done a lot better at expanding those options, but we don't, having a car is very expensive. And if you don't, have access to that, there's not a way for parents or kids to get where they need to be. Rural areas, a lot of times, will have poor road conditions. There's a big problem with flooding here. There's a big problem with, people getting snowed in the winter. And you might notice that rural schools close for extended periods of time when the weather is bad. This past winter, besides just being a pandemic, my children had school canceled so many times for snow. Because the roads, it may appear fine, going into the city of Athens, but in Athens County, they're just not passable in that situation. So those things can prevent people from seeking out help. And also distance to services. There are some school districts in Ohio where from one end to the other, you might be driving, 45 minutes to an hour to get from one side to the other. And so students, might be on a bus for a very long time during the day. And when they get to you, they've already been up and at it for a couple of hours, and that, leads to other issues in school. Parents might not be able to come to a school for an after school activity or for parent teacher conferences when they have to drive 45 minutes in an evening to do that and 45 minutes back. So it's important to kind of understand that you might have to meet people where they are and be appreciative of these issues when you have expectations of people. And what we're going to kind of focus on the next slide are these cultural issues. So I'm going to go to the next one and talk about that some people have in terms of seeking out, service. So culturally speaking, some of these may be real, some of these perceptions, and some of them may be not. But when we talk about people having, a mistrust of authority, like I said, that could lead to them being mistrustful of institutions of education and being mistrustful of social service providers. There's a real sense of independence for some people, where it's hard to reach out for help. And then some people, like I said, may not think that there's any point in it. Maybe they've had a bad experience when they were in school and they just imagine that that's going to, that's just going to continue, and that's just the way school is. I want to talk a minute about stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a theory that came about in 1995 by Steele and Aronson, and it actually originated in regards to African American men going to college. And so the idea was that when you're part of a group that there are commonly held stereotypes about, that when you go into a situation, you are concerned that the people that you're talking to hold those stereotypes. And so that's going to impact the way that you interact with them. So like I said, it's the fear of the risk of confirming negative stereotypes about an individual's racial, ethnic, gender, or cultural group. So when a parent goes to a school and they are talking to an intern or a teacher and they don't know if you're from this area or not, they may believe that you are holding certain stereotypes about them, right? They may believe that you believe that everybody from Appalachia is stupid, or that everybody from Appalachia, is a coal miner or whatever. And so that impacts the way that they interact with you. They can't be open and honest with you. They don't want to be, necessarily having long conversations with you because they're worried that they're confirming that stereotype for you. And that is a big barrier to communication. And then a lot of times there's just a lack of cultural competency of service providers. And we're going to talk about what cultural competency is. A lot of service providers, including, teachers or doctors or whoever we're talking about, may hold these stereotypes about that certain group. They may be making assumptions about that group that are not always positive. And you may not understand, they may not understand how to communicate with each other. If you haven't spent a lot of time in this region, there are places that have a lot of colloquialisms or slang, and have a certain dialect that you may, if you're not from here, have issues understanding. And, that can cause a lot of issues with communicating with families and with students. So when we think about these issues and we think about why families in this region are not reaching out for help from any number of service providers, there's some reasons that we want to talk about developing this idea of cultural competency, which is what you're doing here today. So there was a study that I recently found by Condor and Associates. It's just from 2019, so it's not terribly old, where they did a study looking at pre-service teachers and their feelings about cultural groups that may not be their own. And honestly, I can say, that even if you're from this region and you are Appalachian, that you may hold these ideas about Appalachian people as well, because like I said, we're not provided with a good foundation about our own background. And so they said a cultural divide can present significant barriers in adapting to school processes and expectations linked with the dominant culture and can hamper positive learning outcomes. So when a school is very much set up on a dominant culture system, which in our situation is usually, suburban white middle class, honestly, when a school system is set up in that fashion, then that can provide some discord with students in terms of feeling comfortable there. Studies show that prospective teachers hold beliefs in accordance with the cultural deficit theory. So they found that that teachers, that there were some pre-service teachers that felt that individuals from non-mainstream culture are inferior, not able to sustain middle-class values and expectations in the education system, which is really problematic, right? So if we have a lot of people who are going into classrooms who believe that the culture they're working with is inferior, then you can just imagine the issues that's going to cause in terms of, helping students succeed and feel welcome and feeling comfortable in the school environment. And so, there were some studies that have shown that experience in an intercultural setting or with people not from your own culture, and work on developing cultural competency skills can be effective in preparing teachers to embrace teaching students from different cultures. So the good news is that even though they found that some pre-service teachers had these barriers where they didn't, necessarily respect the culture they were teaching, work in developing cultural competency can overcome that. And that's kind of what we're here to do today. I really like this quote from a book by Susan O'Keefe, and she said, "In the case of Appalachia, as in all others, there is no aspect of life that exists without cultural meaning. Appalachian people have their own way of looking at the world and acting in it. Those who hope to work successfully with them must learn to understand and appreciate these cultural differences." So that brings us to kind of defining, what are these ideas of cultural competency and cultural humility? We use the word a lot, but what does it mean? So cultural competence is defined as a way to practice in a profession while being culturally sensitive to others and showing respect towards their values and traditions. So basically, it's learning about the cultural values and traditions of those that you work with. And that's been a lot of what you're doing here today. That's what I've been talking about. And, when you hear from your speakers about rural areas, that's what you're doing. But the other piece of that you always want to have with cultural competency is the idea of cultural humility. So cultural humility is the process of self-reflection and self-critique that takes place during multicultural encounters that leads to acceptance and respect of other cultural backgrounds. So if you think of cultural competency as learning food and holidays, right? Like, what do these people enjoy doing? And what are, that's more like cultural competency. Cultural humility is more like looking at your own background and your own experiences and how you can understand that in relation to the culture that you're working with. So, what is it about you? What experiences have you had that might formulate these ideas about the region, in your head before you ever even walk into a classroom with Appalachian students? So this is where I wanted to bring back in those words that I had you write down in the beginning. I want you to now look at those words, and I want you to think about where those words might have come from. Did you watch a movie that portrayed Appalachian people in a certain way, and that's maybe why you think of them that way? Have you had personal experience? Are you Appalachian? And those are the words that come to mind because of your experience growing up here. Kind of think a little bit about where those words came from. And when you've kind of decided on one or two of them, if, I know we have a huge group of people, but if there are a few people who want to raise their hand and kind of share one or two of their words and where they think that idea came from, then I think that would be great. So is there anybody who is willing to kind of put it out there where, what their ideas are, even if they're negative? Trust me, I have heard every negative stereotype about this region you can imagine. Yeah, Tanner.
So I grew up in West Virginia, and I live in Rushville, which is by Lancaster. And so I guess I could say that I am Appalachian. A couple of the words that came to mind were poor, white, and drugs.
Okay.
Which is mainly what I've really seen. I know, I appreciate, I love being from here. I love the area. I love the beauty of it. It's just mostly what I've seen is most of my fellow classmates or people that I've seen in West Virginia where I came from, they're really in a bad spot financially. I think that's mostly because usually every time there's a new election and the president either says we're gonna have coal mines open and we're gonna have coal mines closed, it really just changes. But yeah, most I understand that there's a lot of stereotypes, but that's just what I've seen growing up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I would say, growing up in West Virginia, you are definitely Appalachian. Yeah. Other people have thoughts, want to share what their words were and why those are the words that came to mind? There's 107 people in this meeting and nobody wants to share their word. Thank you. Abby?
Yeah, so I ended up thinking mostly of community because I ended up moving into northern Cattaraugus County in New York, so like right at the top of the Appalachian area, about 10 years ago. And even though it's just like on the border kind of being in the Appalachian region, the sense of community was pretty strong. Like I live in a relatively small town, and when we moved in, we had a bunch of people that came to welcome us to the neighborhood, and we had some folks that were asking if we needed any help, like getting to know the area, offering to give us tours of the town and stuff like that. And having come from like Maine and the more northern area of New York, that wasn't something that we had ever experienced before. So that had a pretty lasting impact on my perception of the area, especially now that I know that it is a part of the Appalachian region.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that you had that experience. That's definitely one of the more positive ones. That's good. Yeah. Gabriella?
I would agree. Excuse me. I would agree with Abby. And I did the spring break trip with you last semester or like last spring break. And I just remember that like wherever we were, everybody that we were with was like super welcoming and just like so excited to get to show us like their community. And I thought that was like really nice.
Was there anything else from that trip? Unfortunately, we got cut off in the middle because of COVID. But was there anything else from that trip that you that kind of changed your thinking about the region at all?
I definitely think like not that I really had this thought beforehand, but like I don't know how to word this. People don't want your sympathy because like I remember the one place that we were like looking at that movie theater or well, it wasn't a movie theater, but just the theater, and then like we went down and we cleaned out that whole area. I just remember they weren't like, oh, we need you to help us. It was more of we want to welcome you here and like we appreciate that you're here, but we don't need you to like feel sorry for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that a lot of people hold those beliefs about this region because we've struggled with poverty so long, and is that people, expect, expect handouts and things like that, and that's definitely not the case. So yeah, what she's talking about is a spring break trip that I led with the Center for Community and Cultural Engagement, where we went around Southeast Ohio for a spring break and did community service projects in different communities. So yeah, that was a great opportunity. I hope we can get that off the ground again once this is over with. Anybody else want to say what their words were and why? Anybody have some not so positive ones? Tanner, did you have another one?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add when she was talking about like how they really like, I guess I could say we because I'm part of it. Like how we really don't like asking for handouts. I would agree with that. Like most of the people I grew up with, like they'll give you the shirt off their back without you even asking. But like if someone comes down there and try to say like, oh, we're gonna help you do this, we're gonna help you do that, it's usually met with like, oh, we really don't need your help. We've been doing it this way for so long. If we really wanted your help, we would have asked for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I get like there's a lot of positives. Like most people I met, they're resilient. Like they can take a couple punches in the mouth and everything. It's just like what we've talked about. Most of the time, anytime anybody thinks about Appalachia, they think about how poor it is, how bad of a drug issue there is, and all that. But I think the pros outweigh the cons a lot. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of good stuff that goes on in that area.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Destiny?
I think a lot about music. That was what I wrote down, music. And that's because, country music, early gospel music, swing music and stuff has a lot of the artists from there come from, Appalachian regions, not just, the more poor regions or impoverished regions, but also a little further north, like Dolly Parton and all of them. That was what I was thinking of.
I could talk about Dolly for days, but I'll save you all that. Madison?
Hi, yeah. Some words that I thought of, this is just based off of like my experience. I grew up in Southern Ohio, like down by the river. The first three words that actually popped in my head were hillbilly, drugs, and poverty. Those are the first three things that popped into my head. And honestly, it's just like where I grew up, that was a pretty normal thing. It was like where I mean, those are like just definitely negative things that kind of like popped up in my head, but that's just the community. Well, we also did have the things like other people were saying, like you like other people in the community, it's very tight knit, like they have each other's backs, and that's like a huge part of the community. But there's also like a lot of negative aspects about it, and I definitely would say, like, not to stereotype all of Appalachia that way, but there is definitely like issues as far as drug use and poverty goes amongst much of Appalachia. I mean, a lot of the country, obviously, but it's yeah, that was just my experience growing up in that area and seeing it firsthand and growing up with people that experience the same thing. It has a lot of negative aspects, but it also has some positive.
I mean, several of you have mentioned drugs, and you're 100% right. We are in the midst of an opioid crisis right now, and I don't want to downplay that or not talk about it. But that's an entire I'm teaching an entire semester long class on the opioid crisis in Appalachia right now, and there are a lot of factors that go into that and why that's happening. I think it's important to remember that because people are maybe struggling with substance use disorder and with addiction, that that doesn't define them as people, that doesn't mean that they don't care for their kids or that they don't want things to be better. And I think that sometimes unfortunately that people who are struggling with those issues aren't given that benefit of the doubt. And so I appreciate you all bringing that up. Connor, did you have a comment?
Yes, I think he really spent most of her life in the rural area of Appalachia. All of my work that I've done were more positive, but when I look at Appalachia, I think of the mountains just because of where I live, and you get like a really poor view of like the hills and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think natural beauty is definitely something that a lot of people think of and attribute to this region, and that is something that we're very rich in. So yeah, thank you. And I'm glad to hear that so many of you have positive associations with the region. But the reality is that I feel confident that there are many of you who don't necessarily have positive associations with the region. And so I want you to understand how that can impact your interaction with people, and not just negative, positive as well, right? Like I said in the beginning, if you only believe positive things, then you are, maybe not aware of the struggles that we're dealing with. And if you only believe the negative things, then you're not willing to look past that and see people for being people, really. So I wanted to just, finish up by talking a minute about this idea of cultural humility. And that's basically this conversation we were just having about understanding where those words in your brain came from. That's cultural humility. That is kind of looking at yourself and looking at your experiences and understanding why you feel the way you do about a certain group of people. And this could apply to literally any group of people that you're working with. Appalachian people or inner city people or, a variety of different cultural groups, Native American people. These skills work for all of that. This is actually based on an article that was written. It's getting a little bit older now, but it was written by, it was co-authored by Roderick McDavis, who was the former president of Ohio University. And he co-authored this article called Multicultural Counseling Competencies and Standards, a Call to the Profession. And it was primarily looking at counseling, but it can be applied widely for any service profession that you can imagine. And so there were kind of three basic points to it. In developing this cultural humility within yourself, you have to have awareness, right? You have to understand your own background and impact on the culture that you're working with. So you need to be aware of how people will view you and where you came from. So if you came from a very urban area, people from this region might think about you in a certain way, right? And think that you don't understand anything about them because you came from an area that is nothing like a rural area that they may be from. If you come from a very affluent situation and, have not ever had issues with, poverty or financial hardship, then, people that you're working with are, gonna understand that and also think that you don't understand where they're coming from. So you have to have an awareness of those things about yourself. You need to have knowledge. You need to understand the background of the culture they're working with, and that's the cultural competency piece. You need to understand how the culture views itself and the stereotypes or prejudices associated with it. So if you're working with Appalachian people, you need to realize Appalachian people know the stereotypes that you may be thinking, right? I am very aware that people look at me when I say I'm from Southeast Ohio and think that I might be a dumb redneck or, a hillbilly or, poor or any number of things. I understand that those are things that are associated with my culture. So you need to also understand that I know that and may be more sensitive about it. Skills. So you need to understand the indigenous skills and practices of people in the culture. So when you go into a community, you need to understand and appreciate their dialect. They may not sound like you. They may say words that don't make sense to you, but that doesn't mean that they're unintelligent. And that can be said about any dialect at all. Unfortunately, Appalachia and the South get a very bad rap for having, certain accents that make people believe that that means that they're not intelligent, which is that is not true at all. So understand that that's something that you may encounter, and also understand those institutional barriers to seeking help, like we talked about. If grandma's in the hospital, little Johnny might miss several days of school because of that. And rather than being, frustrated or hold it against the child, understand that that is a cultural practice that is from here, that's what people do. And meet people where they are and work with them within, their own culture to sort out what to do about it. So these three main points are really how you're going to go about developing this idea of cultural humility and cultural competency, and kind of overcoming that study that I told you about earlier that kind of said that pre-service teachers sometimes are predisposed to thinking negatively about cultures that are not their own. And so that's gonna, if you can kind of develop these cultural humility and cultural competency skills, that will get you past that and really be able to help you do the job that you're there to do, right? You're there to help young people and inspire them and get them, where they need to be in life. And you are the first line of people that has the opportunity to really, get in the weeds and make a difference with young people. Like I said, I was never taught anything about my own culture. I was never taught that there were reasons to be proud for being here. We have a very strong core of community activism and community spirit that we should be proud of and that we never learn about. And so you can be that person to inspire people from this region and make them, be proud to be from here. So if you're interested at all, these are the references that I used in this presentation, and I'm happy to send those your way as well. But I wanted to, now we have a few minutes to kind of open it up a little bit to any questions or comments that you might have. Anybody have any thoughts on any of this, or have an experience of working with people in this region that they might want to share? Yeah, Zeke?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about, I think Connor said it earlier. I live in Shadyside, Ohio, which is almost about as eastern as you can get, southeastern almost. I mean, I can look out of my back window and see Moundsville, West Virginia. So every time we would go to the beach or on vacation or take a trip or something, we end up driving through, some of the most beautiful land that you can see, without going out west of like Colorado or something, going down through the heart of Virginia and West Virginia. And I just wanted to say that Connor was absolutely right, that it really is beautiful.
I agree. I've driven from Texas to West Virginia a couple of different times, and I think that West Virginia and Kentucky are the most beautiful states in the country, personally. Yeah, I agree with you for sure. Kevin?
Well, since many of my students are commenting, I figured I better comment as well.
Yeah.
I was raised, my parents are from West Virginia, and I was raised on the stories of West Virginia. And it's a different story in the sense that every day I was told about Clay County and Morgantown. And it was more like a window of here's the beauty of Appalachia. And I wasn't sure if I could step in. And so I spent a long time wrestling on whether I'm Appalachian. And some people know I'm a storyteller, so I was raised on the Appalachian stories. And so I've actually written about the mix of the struggle of Appalachia and affirming. So I loved what you said. You're from West Virginia, and I consider that was the only place that we ever traveled was West Virginia and Ohio. So I thought those were the only two states in the country. And I feel richly rewarded by being raised on Appalachian way of knowing.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I don't think that, unfortunately, that is not as common as we would want it to be. I don't think so.
And thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts from anyone else?
Hi, this is Karen Corcoran from the Chillicothe campus, and I really appreciated your talk today. I didn't grow up in Appalachia, but I have spent my entire adult life here and of course my professional career in this area. So I do appreciate what all the things that you have talked about today. And I feel very proud to serve the students of Appalachia from our regional campus for sure. So thank you today for your talk.
Well, I'm sure that you've noticed that just most people, unfortunately, will say, oh, you've lived here for 20 years. It doesn't matter. You're not Appalachian. Like there's a very strict, insider outsider sort of dynamic. And it's kind of a running joke with a lot of people. It's like, I've lived here for 30 years, but they still don't consider me one of them. And I think that happens a lot in Athens as well. So Martha, I don't have anything else. You are muted. Martha, you're muted, I think.
Sorry about that. Digital immigrant. Okay, first of all, they're grateful you included the graphics that showed Appalachia because they didn't really have any idea what exactly that included. Next, some of the students are required to read hillbillyology for other classes. So I don't know, and some have indicated that they've already read through it. Another thing is, for some reason, it's saying that I'm kicking people off, and I'm not. So, like, Connor, you're there. I can see you. Have you been able to add to the chat?
It says I was disconnected from the chat, but it said connected to talk.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. There's maybe I did send an invitation after the meeting started to another person, so I mean maybe that did it. I don't know. Another question that they have is about recording, and I'm recording the meeting, and I'll be working with IT to get it set up because we got to clip a bunch of it off. I started the meeting to make sure I could get on and do the settings and stuff way before the meeting started, and you all don't want that. So I've got to figure out how to clip that. And hold on a second, I'm still, talking about the importance of, I read it as, I was looking, importance of family and Devil Anse Hatfield, but that's not it. It's Devil all the time. Didn't help with any of the selective news coverage either.
Yeah.
And here's more hillbilly. Foxfire series. James Rogers mentions that, and that was very popular in the 70s, and it is a valuable piece. And then there was Catfish Hunter, maybe a man who did herbal medicine, which was popular at that time as well. Here's another. I read a good book called The West Virginia Mine Wars, David Corbin. I'm reading a book by about Logan County right now. I can't remember the name of it, but I mean, there's lots of good firsthand accounts out there. Oh, and somebody says trashy is a word that comes to mind, and also grandparents. Here's a whole bunch of people that got kicked off. Can you guys see where I'm scrolling through the comments?
I can now, yeah.
Okay. Haley says she's always been told to appreciate what she's got. Appalachia taught me there's a whole variety of people. And the music and artists, I think, have brought a lot of positivity here. I'm thinking of the Judds, of course, from Catlettsburg, Kentucky, and Billy Ray from Sarita Canova. We've got people, and Landell Eugene Murphy, who does the Frank Sinatra type music, won America's Got Talent from the Beckley area. You know, so they have, are bringing, and you know, then we've got Jerry West and some of our sports people who Don Knotts, Barney on the Andy Griffith show was from West Virginia. My dad went to college with him. And people are very much appreciating Tiffany, I got to tell you, as I listen to you speak, I'm inspired to learn more about Appalachia. I love sociology. I love this topic. And I want to get together with you later on and pick your brain a little bit.
Yeah, anytime. It's interesting because I just saw Katie put in the chat about Hill Women and what you're getting wrong about Appalachia. And that brings me to a point about Hillbilly Elegy, is that I know that it's being used, and there are ways to do it where you are kind of examining the universal way he talks about the region, right? So J.D. Vance likes to say a lot of, we don't like to work, we like to be on public assistance, and that's very problematic. And somebody had mentioned earlier, I saw where it doesn't seem like people within the region like the book very much. And I would say that generally that's true, especially in Appalachian studies circles. But I would suggest reading, if you have read Hillbilly Elegy, I would also suggest reading both Hill Women and What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia. And there's a book called Appalachian Reckoning that looks at both why Hillbilly Elegy is problematic and also other stories of people who grew up in this region that are more positive representations.
Would you mind to list those in the chat for us?
Yeah, certainly will.
So that they can get them. I lived in California for 10 years. After I left, I grew up in West Virginia, but I left and went to Missouri for college, and then I went to California for 10 years. And when my girls were born there, and when they were born, I needed to stay home, and because I wanted to take care of my kids, and they were really little, and so, but I also needed an income, so I fell back on some of my Appalachian skills, because we are a craft-based, we are a hands-on, skills-based society, I think. And so I knew how to quilt, I knew how to sew, and so I took in alterations, hemming people's pants and that kind of stuff. And I remember one time this guy came to my house, and we were talking, and he said, you know, he was asking me about myself, and I was telling him, and he said, "You went to college?" Well, yeah, I got a master's degree. At that time, I only had a master's degree. And it was like he was shocked that a person, I guess, with my accent from West Virginia actually went to school.
Yeah, it's hard because I kind of feel like sometimes I walk two lines, right? Because, you know, you're Appalachian and I teach Appalachian studies. And so when I'm at the university, people are surprised that there are professors from Appalachia sometimes. I don't know if that happens on the regional or not, but it happens in Athens. And then when you're out in the community, people are surprised that you're a professor from Appalachia because they don't, you know, they have a certain mindset about people who work at the university. So it's really hard sometimes to navigate both of those. But I've had similar experiences to that for sure. There's actually a lot of stories like that written about intersectionality. You know, there's a lot of stories written by LGBT people, by people of color, about being like a person of color in the region and kind of fighting both of those, having both of those identities and them kind of conflicting with each other. There's a really good book by Jeff Mann where he talks about, being gay in this region and all that comes with that, and then also leaving the region and people insulting him and being shocked that he can read because he's from West Virginia. It's just like, yeah, it's really interesting. But if anybody, I had my email address up there. If anybody wants to chat further, I have list upon list of really great books about all kinds of different topics. Just let me know what you need.
We often I've heard it said that perpetuating the Appalachian stereotype in some ways keeps us safe, keeps us isolated, because city folk don't want to come here. They see us as inbred and undesirable. MTV did a show called Buck Wild.
Buck Wild, oh my gosh, yes.
I loved Buck Wild. I mean, I know it was crazy and I know it was really negative, but I watched it every week.
Well, I grew up on Hee Haw, and a lot of people now are like, well, Hee Haw's offensive, but I never saw it that way. My grandparents didn't see it that way, so.
Right. So I think an awful lot. In order to gain the respect of the larger society, I think it is valuable for us to be seen in a different light. But I can't lose my humor, my sense of humor. That not all Buck Wild was for ratings.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't. It wasn't an exploration of cultural sensitivity.
Oh, right.
I
mean, I'll watch Moonshiners from time to time. I just know what I'm watching is totally fake, So it's, as long as people are aware of that kind of thing, is not a problem. Like somebody had mentioned the Devil All the Time. That was written by Donald Ray Pollock, and he wrote a series of short stories about Knockemstiff, which is near Chillicothe. And it's really over the top and kind of repulsive in a lot of ways, but people are really sucked into the storytelling, and that's fine as long as you understand that is not representing reality. That is not everybody's story, and that everything's kind of exaggerated, and that's people go to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge and they are drawing on every stereotype there is. So yeah, there's a whole discussion we could have about Dolly Parton, who I personally love, but a lot of people have issues with. So
how could anybody have issues with Dolly?
I know, that's what I think, but they think that she's perpetuating stereotypes. But I think Dolly is authentically Dolly, and she's just who she is, and she's very Appalachian and she's proud of it. So there's a lot worse things you can be.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Tiffany, thank you so much. Your talk has been very informational and very beneficial to our students.